Hello, my name is James Arroyo, and this is Chapter 4 Verbal Communication. Verbal communication is the words being said. Nonverbal communication is how those words are being said, along with all of the behavior associated. We're going to watch a quick video on verbal communication and nonverbal communication.
Not as funny as my name, Sebastian Dinwiddie.
Oh, yes.
Funnier than that?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Now, on the St. Louis team, we have who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
That's what I want to find out. I want you to tell me the names of the fellas on the St. Louis team.
I'm telling you, who's on first, what's on second, I don't know's on third.
Do you know the fellas' names?
Yes.
Well, then who's playing first?
Yes.
I mean the fellow's name on first base.
Who?
The fellow playing first base for St. Louis.
Who?
The guy on first base.
Who is on first?
Well, what are you asking me for?
I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, who is on first?
I'm asking you who's on first.
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Well, go ahead and tell me.
Who?
The guy on first.
Who?
The first baseman.
Who is on first?
Have you got a first baseman on first?
Certainly.
Then who's playing first?
Absolutely.
When you pay off the first baseman every month, who gets the money?
Every dollar of it. And why not? The man's entitled to it.
Who is?
Yes.
So who gets it?
Why shouldn't he? Sometimes his wife comes down and collects it.
Whose wife?
Yes. After all, the man earns it.
Who does?
Absolutely.
Well, all I'm trying to find out is what's the guy's name on first base?
Oh, no. What is on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
That's what I'm trying to find
Well,
out.
don't change the players.
I'm not changing nobody.
Take it easy.
What's the guy's name on first base?
What's the guy's name on second base?
I'm not asking you who's on second.
Who's on first?
I don't know.
He's on third. We're not talking about him.
So, the reason why they're having a miscommunication is because they are relying exclusively on the verbal communication. Who's on first, what's on second, I don't know who's on third, has that double meaning. So, without nonverbal communication, verbal communication is entirely meaningless. That being said, verbal communication has a great deal of ability to create meaning, and that's what we're going to be discussing today. So, the chapter outcomes for today is first, we're going to describe the power of language, identify the ways language works to help people communicate, which we'll do with the 5 functional communication competencies, describe ways that communicators create meaning with language, label problematic uses of language and their remedies, and then end off with describing how language reflects, builds on, and determines the context. Let's jump right on in. What I want you to understand about verbal communication is that verbal communication is the actual content, the actual words of what is being said. How the symbols we use affect others, as well as how these same symbols can affect ourselves. This does not, again, capture all meaning. It only captures a small part of meaning, but it is also very valuable. So, language is the system of symbols, words that we use to think about and communicate experiences and feelings. Keeping in mind, it is not just communicating our experiences and feelings, but also we think in language. And the way that the quality of our language is our quality of our thoughts are only as good as the quality of our language. In fact, a lot of people can have very deficient emotional vocabularies. Everything is awesome, or bad, or I'm sad, or I'm happy. All of these things make it so that it is less, so that people think of less distinction between their emotions, and as a result can have much more visceral responses towards something instead of understanding their emotions better. So, language is incredibly important. It is the code that we use, but it also affects our thought. Language is symbolic. As I said before, language is symbolic. The words are symbols or signs that represent a person, idea, or thing. Again, all language is symbolic. Physically, there's no difference between the word chair, light, um, drink, computer, chair. All of these things physically are just sound waves hitting air, but it's the symbolic meaning which we place onto them that represent some meaning. So language is inherently symbolic, but it can vary in its symbolism. Also, thoughts inform language, but language also informs thought. Cognitive language are specific symbols used to describe ideas, situations, and so on. What is good work? Well, for someone of maybe the 1950s, this could be a good job that pays okay and has decent benefits. Whereas nowadays, I would say that good work probably would be beyond this, something that is emotionally satisfying, economically satisfying, and even, and something that is fun. Also, when we communicate to others, this can inform others' thoughts. Saying that I felt this way versus you made me feel this way are more or less the same message, but it provides blame on the other person, and as a result, that can affect their thoughts and therefore lead to a much bigger conflict. Another way that language informs thought is through now versus yet. By simple changes of language, we can go from a fixed mindset, focusing on now, where we are now, versus where we could get by saying words like yet. Simple changes in language like this can affect how we think and therefore make us more resilient in the face of a challenge and overall work harder and longer on things. The nature of language, language is ruled by grammar. There are phonological rules and syntactic rules. Phonological focus on pronunciation. You shouldn't be pronouncing words wrong, go figure. But also, syntactic rules are word placement in the sentence. So we have English language rules, and if we don't follow these rules of grammar, then it can affect how we are perceived. Also, language is bound by context. Communication accommodation theory shows how language and identity shape communication in various contexts. What communication accommodation states is that we will either converge, meaning we will speak in a way that is similar to the person who we are talking to, or will diverge, speak in different ways of this person based on the context we have with that person. So, for example, someone who we may be trying to form a relationship with, we may change our language slightly to be more similar to theirs so that we are able to be more liked, be more similar to them. In the same way, or I guess in the opposite way, those who we do not want to be similar to. This is very much why it seems like with younger children, with people who are younger versus people who are older, younger people tend to diverge, change their language from those of adults. So this may be based on the relational context of child versus adult, and by diverging, it is showing a unique identity. But we also converge to try to be more similar to other people. So moving from what communication is, or verbal communication is, we are now going to transition to why we use verbal communication or the functions of language. Using language for communication acquisition. This involves learning the words of the language. We do this at a very young age. We learn what is appropriate, what is effective in the context due to the situation. We learn language by engaging with language. So it is, in essence, a function of language. We also learn things, not just what words are which and what means what, but we also learn what is appropriate in a given situation. For example, if someone shows you a picture of their baby, this baby, for example, you wouldn't say, oh, this baby is ugly. Oh, it's horrifying. Jeez, you know what? You better save your money now because you need to fix all of that. Obviously, you wouldn't do that because that would be very inappropriate. And I'm sure that very recently we have started to pick up new words that we may not normally have known just through the process of communicating, the process of engaging with language with other people. Another function of language is using language as a means to control oneself, others, and the environment. It is used as a means of control in that I ask you to do something and maybe that influences you to do something for me. So we use language to to control our environment. We also use language to share information. This involves questioning, asking questions, which, funny enough, this is a fundamental part of creating a learning environment, and it is also something that is incredibly vulnerable. So when someone doesn't question when they want to, that can diminish a learning environment and reduce the amount of information that someone can gain. Also, describing something. This is where we very much get into storytelling. We describe a scene so that the audience can imagine it. Also, reinforcing and withholding information, all of which are fundamental parts of language. Another function of language is using language to express feelings appropriately and effectively. So expressing our feelings. Do we usually express our feelings? Probably not. In fact, in our culture, it is looked down on that we express our feelings, although this seems to be changing in recent years with the movement towards mental health, which ties into my next point, that if we do not express our feelings, first, it could cause us to explode later on down the line, but also by not expressing our feelings, the other person cannot understand what we are feeling. So it is in essence a disclosure, and the person may make you feel more of that negative feeling accidentally because they didn't know you were experiencing that feeling in the first place. Also, using language to express creativity, imagining, or the ability to think, play, and be creative in communication is fundamental to human existence and is only possible with language. Not just in our stories, but also in how those stories are told. In fact, Shakespeare used something called iambic pentameter, where there are two beats on five parts in each line. So, in other words, ba 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 ba. That would be that iambic pentameter. So not only did he use his language to tell a story through description, but he also used rhythm of the language, and he didn't actually create any of his stories. He took the stories from other sources, but the reason why it is still taught to this day is because of iambic pentameter, also because of the description that he uses. And we also use language as ritual. Ritualizing or learning the rules for managing conversations and relationships. In other words, being polite, shaking hands, high-fiving. Those sorts of things we are ritualized within our culture. Now we move on to how language creates meaning. Language can create meaning through semantics, the relationship among symbols, objects, people, and concepts, the meaning of the words based in their definitions or placement in the sentence. That is all semantics. So in other words, the meaning of the words definition-wise. That's important. That's needed. But what's more interesting, I think, is the pragmatics of it, the ability to use a culture's symbol system appropriately. This is ripe for hilarity within any TV show or movie about robots. For example, someone says, knock, knock. As if they were starting a knock-knock joke. We know that through the pragmatics, the pragmatic meaning of the start of knock-knock, whereas the robot may then see, oh, come in. Or if someone says, hey, could you lend me a hand? The robot may take off their hand and say, here you go. So the pragmatics are not the dictionary definition. They are instead what we have learned the meaning is. Then we go on to language and meaning. Words have multiple meanings. They have denotative meaning and connotative meaning. Denotative meaning, again, are that accepted definition, whereas the connotative meaning diverges slightly from pragmatics, but not entirely dissimilar. It is the emotional or attitudinal responses we experience with that. So the denotative meaning might be a rose, a flower, whereas the emotional attitudinal response would be here's a romance, or oh wow, they really like me. This also plays into pragmatics, because if I were to give someone a flower, that would that may mean something, whereas pragmatically a rose means something entirely different from any other flower, and therefore, oh, well, I guess not entirely different, but it would be significantly different. That I would then have to that would change the meaning. We also have abstraction, and this is where we get into some interesting parts of language, because with language we can abstract meaning for specific purposes. High levels of abstraction are abstracting the meaning as a lot, whereas low levels of abstraction would be not abstracting the meaning at all. This means evasion, avoiding giving specific details, equivocation, using unclear language, or even euphemism, using inoffensive words. Let's watch a small video regarding this.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms or euphemistic language. And American English is loaded with euphemisms, because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. And it gets worse with every generation. For some reason, it just keeps getting worse. I'll give you an example of that. There's a condition in combat. Most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables. Shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you that.
Okay, so euphemism wasn't very apparent within that, obviously. They went from shell shock to battle fatigue to operational exhaustion to post-traumatic stress disorder, and I would even argue now it isn't even post-traumatic stress disorder, it is PTSD, a random acronym that is completely dehumanized. So this also focuses in using unclear language. Operational exhaustion, very unclear words. Operational, meaning there's some operation happening. Also, and then just exhaustion can happen from multiple scenarios. So using that unclear word and avoiding giving details, all of which is this sort of abstraction, but more on this in the next part, because with this abstraction, especially with evasion, focuses in this abstraction ladder. Your useless would evade a lot of the information, remove a lot of the information, instead of lower abstractions of I noticed you didn't take the trash in the kitchen, the bathroom, or the bedroom. You agreed taking out the trash every Monday, Wednesday evening would be your job. So the which would be better in this situation? In a conflict scenario like this, lower abstractions are a lot more effective because in feedback, we sometimes feel like being abstract or being a little bit vague can soften the blow, but it actually does the opposite. It actually makes it a lot worse. So in regards to feedback scenarios, especially towards something like this, we want to be sure that we're using lower abstractions. But there are some times when we want to engage in strategic ambiguity to have effective communication. In other words, to get what we want. If I want to go out to a party and my parents would not let me, where would I say I'm going? Out. Versus I am going to this party where we are probably going to be partaking in soda with a lot of caffeine late at night. So therefore, I would probably have a hard time going to sleep. So there is some strategic ambiguity here. In the same way, this can also be used to beneficial ends. If someone asks, hey, how does my shirt look? And it doesn't look good, I could say, it looks colorful. By using this unclear language, euphemistic language, it softens the blow. But one of the big challenges with this is that when we soften the blow, it can cause the audience to not really experience it, and as a result, the bigger underlying issue could be pushed to the side. Group identification and meaning also. Group identification also plays into the meaning of language. We have slang, which is using informal, non-standard words like "what's up" or "this is lit" or "spill the tea" or truth. All of these things, obviously, as I am saying them, are probably very awkward because I am of an older generation, and because I do not fit within the group identification of younger generations, when I use slang, then I am seen as outside of that group, and therefore the meaning is different for me of me saying it versus someone within the generation saying it. But as this continues to change, so one day you will not be able to say slang either, or you will be able to say it, but it will no longer be cool. Yes. We also have jargon, which is using technical language for a given job or department. We have technical language within math, within science, within English. Certain jobs have technical language. I remember when I worked at Disneyland, I had to memorize the radio codes: 10.9, 87, 1021, 4030, whatever. But by us all understanding this language, we were able to identify with each other by more or less pushing others out. That is a part of group identification uh, by diverging from other people. With all of this information, all of these different meanings of language, is it possible that we have different meanings and have miscommunication? Absolutely. It is not rare to have miscommunications in regards to communication, but one way that focuses that message is the nonverbal communication. Now we move on to problematic uses of language, some ways that we may use language that we should try to avoid from now on. Hateful or hurtful language. Hate speech is speech that shows hate for another group or incites violence against another group, usually in regards to sex, race, religion, sexual orientation. We should always try to avoid this. Also, hurtful language: you're dumb, you're stupid, you're whatever. That is obviously something that we want to try to avoid as well. We also may want to try avoid labeling. The labels we choose for our beliefs affects how we communicate them to others and how others respond to those. If someone says that they are an atheist, people may respond to them in a different way than if they didn't know that. The label, whereas instead, using a bit of the euphemistic language, I'm not very religious, that can change how others evaluate. But the label may lead us to ignore individual differences and thus limit or constrict our communication with those people. By putting a label on the person, it is ignoring could ignore their individual differences. So we want to try to avoid that as much as possible, because labeling someone as a feminist or as a whatever can have different meanings, and as a result we can ignore the individual differences of the people within it. We also have biased language, which openly excludes or implies something negative about a certain group, saying that someone is poor or ugly or vomiting or whatever, obviously has a negative implication. So we may want to try to use more politically correct terms, but along with this, the euphemistic language can make us avoid the real issue in favor of just being polite. We want to be sure that we're finding a middle ground where we are being politically correct. We shouldn't just start using biased language whenever we want to, but we also want to make sure that we aren't just avoiding the real issue, underlying issue. We also have a profanity. Insulting, rude, vulgar, or disrespectful words or expressions are this profanity. Some may see these offensive words as reasonably hostile based on the situational context. If someone cheated on you, then yeah, you probably have the right to use a little bit of profanity. But if your little cousin cheats in a game of cards and you just start cussing them out, of course that would probably not be effective given the situational context. So we want to be sure that we're finding the right way for this. Another thing that's kind of interesting though is that it can also create some group identification, because as younger kids tend to use profanity more often, because it is that words that you can't say, and because of that it creates its own language and creates group identification of those who use it. Interesting to note, but obviously we should try to avoid it because it can also have some negative attributions, or people can have negative attributions of us if we use profanity. So, how to avoid this information? We want to have civility. The social norm of appropriate behavior, we want to try to match that. Go figure. We should use no words rather than offensive words, using words appropriate to your specific listener. Choose temperate, accurate words over inflammatory ones when commenting on ideas, issues, or persons. This speaks to how it is not that we can, with communication, speak about anything. We could talk about religion, race, whatever, but we have to be able to use it in ways that are more temperate, less inflammatory, and in ways that confirm people's identities versus by trying to inflame them and troll them. Use objective, respectful, non-discriminatory language. Always use clean language at work. Guess what? There have been countless times when someone has said some slur, or not even slur, just used a little bit of profanity at work. Someone else heard it, talked to a manager, and the person got fired. So we want to be sure that we are avoiding using clean language at work. So we want to be sure that we are accommodating to the social norm of acceptable behavior. Now we move on to language in context. Language reflects, builds on, and determines the context. It reflects the context because we have a variety of speech repertoires, different ways that we communicate in different situations. As we've said before, we have cognitive complexity. We can have multiple theories and multiple ideas, multiple meanings of something, and then we start to break it down. In the same way, we also have multiple speech repertoires, and we choose a repertoire given the situation. So, if I am in a situation where I guess I am in trouble, I feel in trouble, then I would conform to a specific speech repertoire of, being apologetic, of, taking responsibility, and of showing that I am apologetic. That reflects the context of this situation. Also, language builds on context. It's based on history and preferences. This focuses in relational context, because if I am friends with someone and I talk in a friendly way with them, then that continues to build the context. Whereas if there's someone who I do not like, then I may use different words to build that context further, that we are not on a good relational context. We're not in a good relationship. And language also determines the context. By using either formal or informal language, we determine the context. By using formal language, it's saying that the context is more important, more formal, whereas informal. So we are now talking about the actual verbal communication and how that relates to the situational, relational, and cultural context. Situational context involves the code switching, changing from one code to another as the situation warrants. We also have high language. This is polite. This also can determine the context. Low language, more casual language, is more comfortable environments. Imagine if you were in a friend situation where you were just casually hanging out and someone said, "Oh, hello, how are you doing today? Oh my goodness, I am so sorry. I did not mean to, blow you up with the rocket launcher in Halo." Of course, that would be a little bit shocking because the context doesn't warrant it. And sex and gender are a part of the situational context as well, because as if we are engaging with someone who is of different sex or gender, then that changes how we communicate with them. We also have different relational context. Using language and levels of abstraction can create or reflect a relationship. When you are in love, you talk about lovely things. If you are in hate, then you start communicating in that way, or even abstract information for those who you do not feel like you have a good relationship with because you do not want them to know what is going on. And we have cultural context. Culture, words, and thought. The way our language is codified in our culture, and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or the linguistic relativity theory states the words a culture uses or doesn't use influences our thinking. The common example of this is that Eskimos have a, like, I think 200 words for snow and ice. So, as a result, they are more likely to see a wide variety of ices and snow more than I would be able to. In fact, there's also indigenous tribes that do not have the number system that we do. We have number tricks. If there are 7 penguins, I put the number 1 on one penguin, and number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, number 6, number 7. Okay, there are 7 penguins. Got it. Whereas some indigenous tribes only have up to 7 numbers. So after 7, they aren't really able to remember exact quantities beyond that number. So our language influences how we see the world. In fact, in English, if I were to break a vase, I would say, "Oh shoot, I broke the vase." Whereas in other languages, they would say, if it was an accident, that the vase broke. In the same way, if I broke my arm, I'd say, "Oh shoot, I broke my arm." Whereas in other cultures and other languages, they would say, "My arm broke," unless I went out specifically trying to break my arm. This has application to the criminal justice system because in our language we assign blame of who did this, versus in other cultures they may not place blame if it is an accident. Very interesting. More on culture. Gender and language affect communication as well. Males tend to use more interruptions. Guess what? We're awful. But females also tend to, and I mean tend to, use intensifiers, qualifiers, hedges, disclaimers, and tag questions. So things that intensify, like very or really, qualifiers, I think, I guess, hedges, I'm not sure, but disclaimers also fall into that. I think I'm not sure, but I think that this is right. And tag questions. That's not really right, is it? That last question is that tag question. Also, both use resistance messages differently. Guess what? In American culture, men and women hold different power in a cultural sense. That being said, the resistance messages are different. So we want to be sure that when there are resistance messages, even small resistance messages in regard for either gender, that we take them seriously. And we have geography can also affect our language choices. For example, in what would you call that? I'd call it an eraser. But in a classroom in Boston, they may call it a rubber. So if someone says to you, "Hey, could you pass me a rubber?" they may think they're saying eraser, whereas another person may think something else. And we have mediated contexts. Communication via technology requires strong, clear language. Powerful or intense language may receive more attention. Guess what? This is indicative of every tagline you see on every title of an article. So we want to be sure that we're using powerful, intense language to gain attention, but also understand that a lot of other people are doing the same thing as well. English has become the language of internet and mass media. Also, technology has created its own language. What are some of the words that are used through technology are lol, raffle. We could go to um, GIF or tweet me, so on. That concludes verbal communication. Have a great rest of your day.